That is tonight's commentary from The Edge. Joining me this time is cross-cultural analyst Colonel Craig Candelore, who served in Iraq. Good to see you, Colonel Candelore.
Thank you for having me.
And national security analyst and USA Today columnist Jim Robbins. Jim Robbins served in the George W. Bush White House in the Department of Defense. Jim, welcome. Let's start with you. General David Petraeus, who commanded U.S. troops in Iraq, of course, during the 2007 and 2008 surge, is now saying that the biggest threat to America is not from ISIS, but rather Iranian-backed Shiite Muslims. Is he right?
Well, he makes a pretty good argument when you look at what's going on in Yemen, where the Houthi rebels have taken over the capital. We had to shut our embassy, and last weekend we took out our troops, our special operators, who were fighting this ideal war on terror that the president mentioned. I mean, those are the Iranian-backed rebels, some of the Iranian-backed rebels he's referencing, so I think he makes a pretty good case.
Let's go to Craig Candelore. Colonel Candelore, you served in Iraq. You are a cross-cultural analyst who watches these events very closely. How big, how dangerous, how long is this problem going to play itself out? When I say it, I mean this violent infighting taking place in the Middle East and its direct threat to America.
Well, Rick, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. I think that the problem is going to get very, very bad. It's going to get terrible, really, before it gets any better.
And how terrible and how long?
Well, I think, for example, ISIS has metastasized across the Muslim countries. You can see the latest attack in Tunisia. You also have uptake of the Sunni-Shiite battle. In fact, I think Iraq has turned into that because most of the attacks against now the ISIS has been done by Shiite-led militia. In fact, the Shiite-led militia in Iraq has actually co-opted really the security forces of the Baghdad government.
All right, Colonel Candelore, is this something that's over in a day or 10 years or 20 years?
Oh, I think it's going to go on probably a decade, unfortunately. But actually, the report, I think I'm backing what Petraeus says. The real problem is that we may win the war against ISIS, but by the same token have made the Shiite militias the power broker in Iraq.
Let's go to Jim Robbins in Washington. Jim, you served in the Bush White House. You know what it's like to be in those meetings and in the field. President Obama's very own advisors advised him against removing 10,000 troops out of Iraq. And that is what created the vacuum for ISIS to gain in its power and acceptance across the region. Why do you believe that President Obama went against the wishes of his very own expert advisors on this?
Well, if you remember, the war in Iraq, shutting down the war in Iraq was a big part of the 2008 campaign. The president has said he doesn't start wars, he ends them. It's a big part of his identity. I think that he had made a promise to do this, and so he just went ahead and did it. But of course, we are not where we were in 2008 or even 2012. Situations have changed, and I think the president is going to have to examine the possibility of putting more troops back in. In fact, we already have put some more troops back in, because otherwise, if we just let it go, it's pretty clear that things are going to get worse.
So in other words, Jim Robbins, what we're looking at here is a president who's concerned about his legacy. You might want to call it window dressing. I'll use those words, window dressing, more than depth, the depth of in specifics of the problem.
Well, I think so, but now at least he was. Now, if he's going to look at his legacy, he has to look at the fact that, yes, things are spinning out of control in Iraq, in Yemen, and other parts of the Middle East. His legacy is going to be defined by that chaos and those civil wars unless he takes some strong action now.
That's a great point. That's a very good point. On the one hand, he's trying to make good on a cosmetic campaign promise, and he's worried about his future image. And now that turned out to be a disaster, he's got to reverse his decision because he's worried about his future image. Let's go to Colonel Craig Candelore. Colonel Candelore, if you were advising the next president of the United States or this president, as you say, you think this thing plays out for a decade. What should we do? What should America be doing right now to start controlling, winning, if you will, this out-of-control war on terror?
Well, I think we need to have a coherent, long-term analysis of the problem, which I don't think has happened. I think there's been some short-term fixes. And what I mean, for example, who long-term will be our allies? For example, I don't think we've supported the moderate Syrian rebels, or we've really also promoted Kurdistan, which could be a stable base. So what I think I'm really saying is sit down and really analyze long-term, because it is spinning out of control. And I don't think there's been long-term thinking. You know, what is the end state that we want 10, 15 years down the road?
Jim Robbins, I found it very fascinating, very intriguing that several Middle Eastern leaders came out yesterday and made positive comments about Ted Cruz after his speech. What does that say about America's reliance America's image in the Middle East by our allies?
I think it says that the leaders in the Middle East understand it's a tough neighborhood, and Barack Obama's kind of idealistic view of things, the Arab Spring and all that kind of stuff, just doesn't play there. We see the results of that. Also, Ted Cruz is a guy who will take a harder line against Iran. And remember, these Shiite militias can be seen as an extension of the Iranian regime. They're really not separate from it. So unless you take a strong stand against Iran, you're not going to get those reined in. All
right, listen, USA columnist, national security analyst Jim Robbins, we thank you for joining us. And Colonel Craig Candelore, I should say, and cross-cultural analyst, we thank you also.